kids. So we just finished our unit on medieval Islamic art. We're going, before that unit, I hope you remember that we looked at Byzantine art. Byzantine art was a movement or style that developed in the eastern part of what used to be the Roman Empire. And so now what we're doing is we're kind of backtracking and going back to the western part of the empire and looking at how Christian art developed in that area. So this period is referred to as the migration period. This is referencing the different tribes and invaders that were, settling and invading during the period of the late Roman Empire. And began to root themselves within the territory, and essentially settled and again sort of absorbed some classical traditions from the Greco-Roman period, but also started to infuse some of their own traditions. And also with that, we combine this spread of Christianity, so it becomes a very interesting mix of styles. It's also referred to as the Hiberno-Saxon style. So I want you to think about some issues to consider and think about as we're looking at some of these works. A new style based on the interrelationship between migratory tribes, Christianity, and the Greco-Roman tradition. Number one, a breakdown of central power of the Roman Empire. So again, that's referencing the Roman Empire. Remember, we were talking about the late empire, Roman Empire, when Constantine was the first Christian emperor, and then this sort of division of the empire in half. Anyway, and then there's this fusion of Germanic migratory and tribes, these sort of invaders on the western part of the divided Roman Empire, and Roman culture, and then again mixing in with all these elements is this sort of unifying influence of Christianity that sort of brings these two different cultures together. So Christianity kind of brings Roman culture with and infuses it with the styles and some of the traditions of these invading migratory tribes. So Hiberno-Saxon style is a fusion of animal style with Christian iconography or content. So it looks quite different than the Byzantine art that we studied in the East. So this is a map. This is the area that we're going to be looking at. So here's Italy. Remember, Italy looks like a boot. So with Byzantine art, this is sort of the area that we were bouncing around in. Now we're going to return back to Italy and Rome. This is where the capital, the traditional capital was during the Roman Empire. And then remember, Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople in the east. There's Ravenna. We did study a Byzantine church in Ravenna because Justinian, one of the emperors during the Byzantine era, did have an outpost there, and so we were able to see some of the Byzantine interior decorative programs of these churches. But we're going to be bouncing again around this area, and again up in here into what we think of as modern Europe today. So we are returning to the western part of what used to be the Roman Empire. While the East was somewhat stabilized, the West had a mingling of cultures, and with this integration, a dramatic change takes place in the West and in their artistic styles and conventions. So here's a zooming in of the map, and again the area or the territory that we're going to be exploring. Migratory tribe invasions really disrupted the area in the West. We had discussed that when we were talking about the late days of the Roman Empire, and then the sort of transition to Constantine, and who became the first Christian emperor. So there was a lot of disruption in the western part of the Roman territory. In the east, they were able to maintain their connection to the classical ancient world to a certain degree, and we did discuss that. So when we were talking about Byzantine art, we did see this shift to a different style because of this need of expressing Christian iconography. You know, the figure, you know, becomes more stylized, the figures become more flat, but there is still some hints and echoes of some of the Greek and Roman classical traditions that we did discuss, and it's important for you to understand that. In the West, though, their connection to the classical world was a little bit different. One migratory group called the Anglo-Saxons, and you want to think of this era of Beowulf. I'm sure that's one of the greatest works of literature you've ever read, love it, located in Germany, generated a new style of art. So I'm trying to give you a context of the period that the period in history that we're thinking about. All right, so here's an example. Sutton Hoo was a site of a ship burial found on a farm in England, which during the period was in utter chaos, often attacked with different rival kingdoms ruling various parts of the region. As a result, there are not a lot of examples of architecture and sculpture. The ship recovered was at Sutton Hoo. It was about 90 feet long and designed for rowing, not sailing. It was a grave ship where treasures were buried with its occupants. And some of these ships were buried at sea. So this was sort of a funerary tradition that of this particular migratory tribe. Because of the unstable environment, historians find a lot of objects and artifacts related to warfare, such as shields, swords, etc. This is an example of a purse cover. These objects enhance their owner's prestige and testify to the stature of those buried with them. So these objects were often buried with their owners. In the epic Beowulf, his comrades buried Beowulf's ashes in a huge tumulus overlooking the sea, an everlasting tribute to Beowulf's greatness. They also, in the story, supposedly buried precious rings and brooches in the barrow with him, again, as a sign of respect. So when we look at this purse cover, you kind of want to think of the purse cover sort of as a cover-up. This would have gone over a leather bag, and you can kind of think of this as like the fanny pack of the medieval migratory world. During this period, artists produced exceptional metalwork combined with a technique called cloisonne, and that's spelled C-L-O-I-S-O-N-N-E, where chambers and channels were dug into the metal and precious stones were melted and poured in between the channels. Today, you've probably seen examples of cloisonne with Asian jewelry, where they actually use metal, and instead of stones, they melt enamel. But this is the first technique of cloisonne, where they would melt precious stones. Let me see. The migratory tribes were constantly on the move in search of food. As a result, animals and migratory patterns are often incorporated into the decorative work of these objects. Notice the hooked beaked bird. Let me see if I don't know if I can zoom in while I'm... Oh, good. I can zoom in a little bit. So here's what they're talking about here. This is referred to as a bird of prey, attacking a more passive bird. Right here, kind of looks like a duck. The use of intricate pattern interlaced with animal motifs. So here we see this pattern, and this, to me reminds me a little bit of Islamic patterning that we studied in our last unit, is a characteristic of this period. So very different than the Byzantine Christian art that we looked at in the East. The use of knotting pattern is especially unique, so this is what they're sort of referring to in this area. With interlacing of abstract forms. The human figures are depicted frontally, so this is supposed to be a human figure right here. Here's his face, eyes, looks like he has a mustache, and it looks like he has an open mouth. Perhaps he's screaming, and anyway, so, and then here's the cloisonade. So here are these sort of channels that have been dug out into the metal, and so this is probably lapis lazuli that's been sort of melted and embedded in between these sort of chambers, coral, and then obviously this beautiful gold metalwork. So this is another example from the Hiberno-Saxon style, and this is on your official list of 250 works for the AP College Board. So this is called a fibula, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. Most characteristic of the prestige adornments of early medieval period was the fibula. This was a decorative pin that Romans wore. Both men and women alike used the fibula to fasten their garments, usually around the shoulder. And this pair is a Visigoth. This is one of the migratory tribes, fibula. It's another great example of the barbarian or Hiberno-Saxon metalwork and cloisonade technique that we saw with the fanny pack, the purse cover. In recent centuries, again, I pointed out that in recent centuries, especially with Asian jewelry, that they use enamel as opposed to precious stones. But in older periods, such as this one, they actually inlaid cut gemstones in glass and other materials. So this is a mixture of ornate garnets and amethyst and colored glass. Pendants could have been hung from the small loop at the bottom of each fibula. Covering almost the entire surface of each fibula are decorative patterns adjusted carefully to the basic shape of the object. Often the early medieval metalworkers so successfully integrated zoomorphic animal elements, so zoomorphic means human and animal forms, that they almost become unrecognizable. So if we zoom in a little bit, let me see if I can do that. What kind of animal is that, do you think? You might not have noticed it right away. But this example incorporates a fish just below the center of each pen. The looped forms around the edges are stylized eagle heads. So let me see if I can. So I think this is what they're talking about right here. So again, very abstract, very stylized, and almost unrecognizable. And then you see the little red garnet forming their eye. Alright, so I have added the title. I don't think I had it in there before. But the title of this work is Pair of Moravian Looped Fibula. So this is the title I would expect you to be able, to write down in your identification. You know, even if you just wrote Moravian and Fibula. But you can't just write fibula, okay? there's tons of them. So I and the AP Art readers need to know which one you're referring to. All right. So now we're going to move into this mixture of Christianity themes and iconography. So this is the Gospel of St. Matthew. It's a page from the Gospel Book of Durrow. From the second half of the 7th century. Again, this is still under the Hiberno-Saxon style, but now we're starting to see this fusion of these migratory styles and traditions with Christian iconography. So what is a gospel? A gospel recounts a life of Jesus of Nazareth and his teachings, which from the foundation of the Christian